just remind you that my presentations comes from about 30 years of works in Africa. I've been working in Nigeria, in Togo, where I also teach at the University of Lomé, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, South Sudan, and Uganda. So I have quite a big experience in working on ecological and conservation stuff in Africa. And especially it's 2 years now that I've been the editor-in-chief of the African Journal of Ecology, that, as you know, is the most important, the foremost journal of ecology and natural history of the continent. And it's the journal that receives about 450 papers per year, which means that in about 2 years I've handled about 900 manuscripts. And so I have quite a good experience of the main qualities and issues that African authors have in delivering their science. So in this short presentation, I want to summarize the trends, and I want to tell you the way out for the issues that the African scientists are experiencing in delivering their science. First of all, is we have not to hide ourselves into. We have to tell the truth, and it is clear that African science has always suffered marginalization and discrimination from the academia of the northern world. That's not new thing for Africans, because as we know, they have been marginalized and discriminated in so many aspects of the human societies that science is just among these. But this is a fact. We know that in theory, scientific journals are peer-reviewed. We know that in theory, all of us are the same, but in fact, it's not this. And one of the problems is that normally in the peer review system, the people ignore the authors are known to the referees, but the referees are not known to the authors. So this asymmetric situation makes that any people, any referees that has a discriminating view about Africans and African science will make his decisions based on that. I can assure you that in 2 years working on the African Journal of Ecology, I know that these things happens, and not so rarely. So when every time that I see this point, that this is a problem in a review, I cancel that reviewers. I cancel that reviewers forever. But this is a fact. So this is the prejudice. But there are also problems with the skills of African scientists in working on their papers. And that's a fact. So as an editor, I have always to understand the differences, that whether a paper that is judged based on prejudice or based on the true shortcomings of the paper itself. Of course, the second aspect, which is the shortcomings in writing papers, is very important, but can somehow solved. So I published an editorial in the journal that you see in this slide, in how to make your African ecology paper stand out to a global audience, that describes in detail the key points that I am examining in this short presentation. And I recommend all of you to read carefully this paper, because I think that is very important for not only African scientists, but scientists in general from developing countries, because it will help them to better present their data and to minimize the problem. So I want this small presentation is just like a user's guide on how to make a paper and how to make a paper appealing to a general readership. In international journals, including the African Journal of Ecology, you have to consider that a paper being accepted or not depends not only on the quality of the data, but how interesting.
Sorry, Professor. We cannot see the next slide. Maybe it's stuck or.
Can you see the new slide?
Yes, we can see it now. Yeah.
Okay. It is not only the quality of the data that are important, but also how broad, how general is the subject for people that lives in and works in different regions of the world. Okay. This is one of the main problems that we have in African papers. Sometimes, several times, the data are good, but the paper does not appeal to a general audience. So typically, for instance, African authors put useless details in the title, like the community of birds in Dananè province, Montagne district, Western Ivory Coast. When you put this kind of details, automatically you make your paper to be of local interest. All the readers from Europe or from the USA will automatically think that your paper is not very interesting. So when you publish something, you try to submit something on ecology or conservation, you have always to think how your subject can appeal to a general audience. So the first point that you have to follow is that your research papers should be explicitly hypothesis driven. This is crucial. If your paper is just descriptive, it will have automatically low priority in the desirability that the journal will have for your paper. If you use your data to test explicit hypotheses, then your paper has more chance to be considered. Okay. Now, anybody that works in Africa know that most of the research is done, for instance, using grants or contracts from companies that are not interested in the ecology, but for instance in business. So, for instance, energy companies and so on that just give money for the environmental assessments. Well, basically those research produce baseline survey data, but still these data are interesting if the authors are able to make them hypothesis driven. I just put here an example. Concerning Uganda, we had a research grant that was to evaluate the baseline biodiversity, herpetological biodiversity of a wetland area in central Uganda, where activities of restoration and so on were planned. So we collected data in the usual way for baseline surveys, so nothing particularly difficult, nothing particularly innovative, just routine research that would have had no place in an international journal. But what we did was to extrapolate the results that we obtained and tested one important theory, which is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So basically, we divided our data into three different subgroups of data. One relative to the most intact part of the wetland, one on the most damaged, altered part of the wetland, and one in which the wetland was restored, had been restored by some activities, by some restoration activities by the company, the company providing the grant. And we tested the hypothesis that the highest diversity level should be at the intermediate place. This is an important theory about how biodiversity evolve, and so make our study case interesting for an international public. So this is just an example. We published the paper just a few days ago. This is just an example, but that make your data interesting. As you can see in the upper side of in the upper left of this slide, you see that there are some saturation curves. So, for instance, the use of curves of theoretical analysis make your paper interesting, because what is interesting in this case is not really which species I have found and which species I have not found. What is interesting is if my sampling were sufficiently good to understand something about the community structure. So if most of the species were really detected, and all this kind of data. So always remember that when you write a paper, it is important that you make it interesting to the global public by explicitly state hypotheses and discussing those hypotheses in the discussion. So nothing descriptive, but try to make it as most theoretical as possible. The second important point that partially depends on the first one is that important data should be generalized. So to generalize your data, first look at the title. Don't include the precise localities because nobody cares. But think at the ecological background. So, for instance, if I am working on a paper on a forest area in Ivory Coast, instead of writing in the Dananè area, mountain region, it's better to write into a mountain rainforest, West African mountain rainforest. So you have to immediately give a ecological context that can be interesting for the global public. So habitat describing the habitat in the title is okay. The vegetation zone is okay. The level of the community that you are studying, for instance, guild, etc., is okay. The scale is okay, like for instance, landscape rather than local level and so on. But avoid putting specific locations if not of special interest. Okay, so this is important. The third suggestion that I can give you is never underestimate the ignorance of scientists, of Western scientists, of Northern scientists about African geography and ecological systems. Just to give you an idea, some years ago, I was invited in a US university in Pocatello, in Idaho, by the Idaho State University to speak about my studies on snake communities in Nigeria. Of course, I did my presentation, and then I was discussing my presentation with several colleagues, all professors and so on, of biology at the university. Well, they asked me in which way I was talking in Nigeria with the people. I told them I'm talking in English, And they were so astonished, so surprised, because the assonance of Nigeria is not English, is Latin. So they thought that in Nigeria people were speaking Italian. And they were completely surprised by this fact. Okay? This means that even for the academians, Africa is something completely external to their culture, to their normal environment, and they don't know anything. If you ask 80% of the people in the northern world, of the scientists, where Togo is, they will not be able to point it on the map. If you ask them where is Abidjan, they will not know where is Abidjan, despite it's one of the biggest cities in Africa. Okay, so you have to think exactly that what I'm saying now is right. So people outside Africa don't know anything about Africa. So never abuse of local terms, even of ecological stuff. So, for instance, if you use vegetation zones, the name of vegetation zones like Miombo woodlands, they don't know what it is. If you write Zipele, which is a bare land in Burkina Faso, they will never know. Dahomey Gap, they will never know what it is. So you have always to compare, to use terms, at least in the title, that can make their paper to be attractive. So instead of putting Zipele, write bare land. Instead of Miombo, write woody grassland mosaics, something like that. The people that read you should understand what you are talking about. Okay, this make much easier for you, for your paper to be considered by editors, and much easier to be well considered and well read by readers after the paper is eventually published. The fourth suggestion is mind the maps you are producing for your article. And this is a normal problem with African scientists. Now the use of GIS technologies in Africa is very widespread. Even in small universities, it's easy to find people who work well with GIS. But the emphasis of their maps is always on political points. So, for instance, the map that you can see on the left of the slide is typically the one that I receive from manuscripts submitted to the African Journal of Ecology. A map that is completely useless for any ecologist because nobody cares where is the province blah, the blah blah, the province B, the province C, and so on. Nobody cares. What we care is ecology. So, for instance, a land use map, a vegetation use map, like on the right of this slide, makes your map much more interesting and give the reader the feeling that you know your stuff, that you know what you are publishing about. Whilst if you are, for instance, publishing a paper on the forest ecology and you put a map of the provinces, immediately the reader will understand that you just put a map just because you like putting a map, but without any scientific reason. So this is absolutely important to consider. You also need to consider that the only names, locality names that you can put should be the names that you cite in your paper. So if you have a paper in which working about Nigeria, okay, and you work in Western Nigeria, but not in Lagos, it's not necessary to put Lagos, but you have to put in the map the place names in which that are cited in the text. Okay, again, this is important because most of the readers don't know anything of Africa, so they will look at the map searching for the names that you put in the text. It can be somehow surprising, but believe me that many people don't know where Lagos is. They will never, for sure they maybe Lagos, for sure they don't know where Abuja is. Okay, so and this happens in the west, in Western Europe. It happens in the USA and Canada, and it will happen also in Japan and China. So basically, nobody will read you, and the editors will consider your study very local if you don't put these kind of things. So the suggestion is, don't use GIS blindly, because it's better don't putting any map than putting the wrong map. If you decide to put, if you don't have access to land use maps, vegetation maps, and so on, better that you put a table with your geographic coordinates than a nonsense map with the provinces and so on. Another concept is the last one that I want to highlight is, think very carefully at the references of your article. Very often, African authors cite very local citations, maybe written by them, in journals that are completely unknown, in many journals that are fake, that are even predatory journals, and all these things automatically disqualify the paper. Very often it happened to me, especially in some areas in Africa, it happened to me to see cited even big theories like sexual selection, in which, for instance, instead of citing people like Darwin or Lamarck, Maynard Smith, and so on, they cite a ridiculous review written by a local professor, published in a completely unknown journal, that is just a poor quality paste and copy article from better places. So it is very important that the African authors should do a serious research on Google Scholar for identifying the potential international papers that should be cited. So they can write the authors and getting the reprints and so on. But it's important that that good literature is cited in the text. This is very crucial, because automatically, if a reader, a referee, sees that you cite completely irrelevant papers, you will think that you, as an author, you don't know anything of that subject, and you will be rejected. Okay. Local references should be used only to fix very specific points in the discussion, or, for instance, the study area, nothing more than that. Consider that statistically, 99.99% of the patterns that you are seeing in a study have been already seen by other scientists before you. Those scientists should be cited. Okay, so this is crucial. Another important point is that every single point that need to be fixed should be fixed with no more than 2 or 3 references. So you have to select the best one that are possibly found. So this is also very, 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 very important for improving your paper. In general, you have to consider that since in the introduction, at the end of the introduction, you have to put the key questions that you are trying to analyze in your paper, in the discussion, you should analyze these key questions. Okay? Whilst very often the typical discussion of the African scientist is just summarizing again what they have seen. Nobody cares. The results are results. The discussion should discuss the results that you have obtained. So if you are able enough to put some key questions, you have to answer to that key questions using your data. So this logical point should be done. Now, the last thing that I want to tell you is that There is not one Africa. There are several Africa in terms of scientific terms. I published in another editorial in the journal, for instance, the percentage of papers that are accepted country by country in Africa when there are countries that submit a lot of papers. Well, the first one in Africa is Ivory Coast. For me, Ivory Coast is the best country in Africa in terms of ecological science. 75% of the papers that I receive from Ivory Coast are accepted. The second country is South Africa. These two countries and a few others are better than the USA. The USA statistics is about 55% of acceptation. So this means that there are some African countries in which the research is very good. But we have some African countries in which the research is so poor. Just yesterday, I looked, for instance, at some statistics, and it came out that for Algeria, I received 71 papers last year, and the percent of acceptation was 0. No paper from Algeria was accepted out of 71 submissions. Ethiopia is another country that is terrible in terms of quality of science. So there are other countries are good. Uganda is good. Togo is good. Nigeria is quite good. So it depends very much. Some countries, people from some countries know better how to present their data for an international readership. Others don't know. So the final point that you have to remember are that when you use references, no local references or very low, very scarce numbers. Most of them should be international references. Remember that nobody cares if you have published plenty papers in local journals. It's much better that you publish few papers in big journals than many papers in local journals. So you should avoid that people will think that your readers will think that you are superficial in the selections of the paper that you cite. And that's all.
Okay. Thank you. I guess you have finished, right, Professor?
Is okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. I think it's now time if you can give us a 5-minute translation in French, and then we will open the session for question and answer.
Okay. In French. Okay. Wait. Let me put the. Adesso devo fare. Consentire. Oddio, adesso. Now I cannot put again the screen. Wait. Cioè, che devo fare qui? Ah, wait. Okay. I think that you have the screen again, eh?
Yes, we can see it again, yeah.
Ok. Donc, je peux dire que beaucoup les scientifiques africains normalement avons beaucoup de problèmes à publier leurs données dans les journaux internationaux d'écologie et de conservation de la nature. Normalement, la publication, c'est avec des scientifiques d'Europe ou de l'Amérique, parce que la préparation technique de beaucoup de scientifiques africains, c'est pas trop bien. Mais surtout, leur ne connaît pas comment faire les publications d'intérêt général pour les référistes, pour les lecteurs des journaux scientifiques. Donc, après deux années d'expérience as l'éditeur en chef des journaux africains d'écologie, j'ai préparé come si dice suggerimento? Quelques idées pour faciliter la publication delle données. Donc, les premières données, les premières idées, c'est de préparer les articles hypothesis driven, articles qui testent directement des hypothèses générales des théories écologiques. Donc, aussi si tu fais une recherche très locale, tu peux trouver des patterns qui sont généraux pour de grands intérêts pour les scientifiques qui ne sont pas africains. Donc, tu dois chercher de tester les hypothèses écologiques avec tes données et ne pas simplement faire une description empirique des données que tu as collectées dans le terrain. C'est important aussi que les données soient généralisées. Donc, tu dois éviter d'écrire la localité de ton recherche dans les titres de l'article, mais c'est mieux de focaliser l'attention sur les domaines écologiques. Par exemple, la zone de végétation, l'habitat, le niveau de la communauté biotique que tu étudies, et comme ça. Tu dois chercher de minimiser l'utilisation des termes locaux. Par exemple, ici, la savane Miombo, ou les ipelés, ou les Dahomey Gap ne doit pas être cité dans les titres, mais c'est mieux de placer des mots qui sont généraux. Par exemple, la savane ou la forêt galerie, comme ça, mais non la localité. C'est aussi très important que les maps sont produites bien. Donc, les maps qui sont comme la map à la gauche, qui sont avec les secteurs politiques de l'aire d'étude, par exemple, les provinces comme ça, sont pas intéressants. Mais les maps comme à la droite, qui présentent les zones de végétation, l'usage de terrain comme ça, sont intéressants à voir. Donc, c'est mieux que tu ne places pas les maps à la gauche, mais tu dois placer les maps comme à droite. Là è la fin les derniers comments, c'est que tu dois citer seulement les articles qui sont publiés dans les journaux internationaux d'écologie. Donc, c'est important que les scientifiques locaux veillent à chercher bien les références bibliographiques avant de soumettre l'article pour la publication. Parce que dans l'Europe ou dans le Nord-Amérique, on n'a pas d'intérêt à lire articles publiés dans un journal très local ou journaux qui sont faux, qui sont faux, comme beaucoup des scientifiques africains utilisent pour leur documents pour leur article. Donc, les scientifiques africains ne doivent pas être superficiels dans la sélection des références bibliographiques, mais doivent lire bien les articles scientifiques internationaux et doivent placer les références propres tous les documents que leur va écrire. Merci.